So, in our journey through talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, we've looked at the history of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the individuals who made the Dead Sea Scrolls, what types of books you can find if you read through the Dead Sea Scrolls. And last week we looked at the integrity of the Hebrew Bible based upon discovering the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that is, we can trust that the Bibles we have in our cell phones and in our homes and have wonderful, lovely covers for today, those Bibles are accurate representations of the Old Testament and the New Testament from 2,000 years ago. And this evening, and I wanted to do last week's first to show that, yes, the Dead Sea Scrolls show the integrity of the Scriptures. This evening, though, I want to look at places where there are corrections, maybe corrections to the Hebrew Bible from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So these are a few of the places, and I think these are the most significant of all the places where the Dead Sea Scrolls are different from the Hebrew Bible that we had already possessed before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I think it's important to go through these in order, one, to bring this all to light. One, because there's a couple of places where I do think the Dead Sea Scrolls legitimately are, it's the right reading, and the Masoretic text that we were using before, the Leningrad and Aleppo Codex, are not correct. And there's a few places for that. But then this also shows how, what's the right word to say, how lack of significance the changes end up being. We have no bombshells that are here. And so I think it's important to be honest about the corrections that are there, and it helps us to see that none of them are overly significant. So we shouldn't hide our head in the sand and pretend that these corrections don't exist, but we want to take the accurate information that is available to us today. I couldn't find a good way to put these passages in an order, so it's just kind of a little random as far as how we'll jump through the Bible and look at these places where the Dead Sea Scrolls were different from the Masoretic text in the Hebrew Bible in ways that weren't just simply those spelling, scribal type errors, or they accidentally dropped off a word here or a word there. Our first change, though, is a verse where the difference is one word, but I believe that one word does have significance, and that is in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 11. Isaiah 53 is the very famous poem of the suffering servant that we believe is a prophecy of the Messiah, Jesus Christ, and of the suffering that he does on our behalf. And our change from the Dead Sea Scrolls comes in Isaiah 53, verse 11. In the New King James Version, it reads, "He shall see the labor of his soul and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant shall justify many, for he shall bear their iniquity." So the Masoretic text tells us that the suffering servant will end up seeing his own labor, and he will be satisfied as a result of the suffering and his justifying of many. So the Messiah will see the work that he's done, and he will be satisfied with the work that he has completed in his suffering. The Dead Sea Scrolls, while this is going to read a little bit different in the translation, there's only one word that's actually different from the Masoretic text and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls read, "After his anguish," so after the labor of his soul, "he will see light and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will carry their iniquities." That translation is from the Christian Standard Bible, and they took this addition from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the addition is the addition of the word light in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And adding that word light is taken by scholars, Bible translators, to be a way to speak of God himself. And so the idea is, at the end of his suffering of his souls and his anguish, he will see the light, who is God. So this is a prophecy that he will see God after his suffering. God will raise him up to the light and be satisfied in what the suffering servant has done. So instead of the son looking to himself to be satisfied, it will be the son looking to the light and being satisfied the fact that he can see the light and be in God's presence, and then actually God in turn then also looking at the son and being satisfied in him. So this would be a subtle prophecy, prediction of the resurrection of the Son and being brought into the presence of the Father as the light. And this light isn't original to the Dead. It's originally in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we were aware of this reading before our discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls because this is also in the Septuagint, that is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. But before, we had always gone with the Hebrew Bible because it didn't have light, assuming that light could have been like maybe an addition from the church. Like maybe it was the church who wanted to add that light there to point to the fact that after the Messiah suffers, he will then be raised into the light. So maybe the church added that. It was never there in the Hebrew. Well, it turns out because of the Dead Sea Scrolls, we know light was there all along. So I think that this is a correct reading that we should have in Isaiah 53:11. Most of the newer Bible translations will add it in there, such as the Christian Standard Bible, and it points to the resurrection of the Messiah. And then we have another small addition. This one not really theologically significant at all, and it's in Leviticus chapter 2, verse 1. In the New King James Version, it reads, "When anyone offers a grain offering to the Lord, his offering shall be of fine flour, and he shall pour oil on it and put frankincense on it." And the Dead Sea Scrolls simply has a short addition of two words at the end, and those two words are, "It is an offering." So it doesn't really change a lot to the passage. Simply saying that when you're offering this grain offering, you're freely offering it up. You're not being forced into doing this. It's freely given in worship and to glorify the Lord. It's not a requirement. It's not something that God put upon the people. This is free worship that they're offering to them. I think the Masoretic text probably inadvertently dropped this off. It is also found in the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint. So again, this is another reading that we knew about before, but it wasn't in the Masoretic Hebrew text. But now we see that it was in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I'm going to guess that most newer translations will probably add this on as well. So this is just another emphasis at the end of this verse to say, when you're making this grain offering, God isn't twisting anybody's arm to make them offer it. You're freely giving it up to God. You're giving it because you want to worship and glorify Him. It's similar to the way that we talk about offering in the church. Like, I don't go up to anybody and be like, "Have you given your 10% tithe to the church this month? If you want to keep coming here, you got to put your money in the box." We say freely give to the Lord as He has blessed you. And that's what that additional phrase is saying to Leviticus chapter 2, verse 1. Our next addition is the one that I would say is the most obvious verse that was discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that was definitely part of the original writing, and we didn't know about it until we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that is in Psalm 145, verse 13. And it should be what is 145, verse 14, and then we push all the rest of the verses down one number. But Psalm 145 is an acrostic. Does everybody know what an acrostic means? It's where you have the first letter of each line spells a word or has some type of significance. Well, there's a couple of acrostic poems in the Psalms. The most famous of them is, the most famous acrostic in the Psalms? Psalm 119. Each section begins with a different letter in the Hebrew alphabet, and in that section, all the lines begin with that same letter. Well, Psalm 145 is also an acrostic. And every line in Psalm 145 begins with the next following line in the Hebrew alphabet. So line 1 begins with Aleph, line 2 begins with Beth, Gimel, and you could go all the way down to the Hebrew alphabet, each line beginning with another letter in the Hebrew alphabet. But there was always something a little off about Psalm 145 in our Bibles. We don't notice it because we read English and not Hebrew, but if you were reading Hebrew, it'd be a big notice because the letter Nun was missing. That line for that letter in the acrostic was not there. It would kind of be like saying your ABCs in English and skipping the letter N, saying LMOP. It's kind of even hard to say out loud without just spilling out the N. But the Nun is missing in there. It just sounds wrong. Well, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in one of the copies of Psalm 145 that they have, it supplied for us the missing Nun line. So here's Psalm 145, verse 13 in the New King James Version. "Your kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and your dominion endures throughout all generations." And if you read it in the Christian Standard Bible, you read, "Your kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, Your rule is from all generations. The Lord is faithful in all his words and gracious in all his actions. So there is the nun line of Psalm 145, verse 13. It's not a mind-blowing verse at all. We know from many other verses that God is faithful in what he says, that he is gracious in all of his actions. I mean, when the Lord revealed himself to Moses, he started by talking about his gracious character to his people. So we know all of these are true, but at the same time, I'm really thankful that we have that missing line of the poem. So a center line in Psalm 145 we now have, and I think pretty much every English translation that's been brought out since the introduction of the Dead Sea Scrolls has included this in there because this is just such a, you know, shock that it would not be genuine. So we have finally have the nun line in Psalm 145. So I'd say out of all of the additions to new translations in light of the Dead Sea Scrolls, this one is the least controversial. To me, this is the slam dunk. This is the one we know is true. And we'll go from that to, let's go to the most controversial one, which has stirred up kind of a whole world of new content about the angelic and demonic world. To get to the significance of this one and the reality that even though it stirred up a lot of controversy, it might actually be genuine, we start with Hebrews chapter 1, verse 6. So in the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews 1:6, we read, and when he again brings the firstborn into the world, he says, and let all the angels of God worship him. Now, if you were to look into most English translations of the Old Testament, New King James Version being one of them, that phrase, and let all the angels of God worship him, you could look all day long, all year long, and you will never find that phrase anywhere in the Old Testament. And so it looked like initially that maybe the author of Hebrews, when he says, brought out a quote that wasn't even from the Old Testament, like it doesn't even belong. But we had an idea that this is probably a genuine quotation of the Old Testament, thanks to Justin Martyr. Now, Justin Martyr is famous as one of the earliest authors in church history. One of probably him and Irenaeus were the first two to write lengthy works that had tons of scripture quotations in them. Well, in one of Justin Martyr's writings, he quotes Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 43. And in Justin's quoting of Deuteronomy 32, verse 43, Justin writes, rejoice, O heavens, with him, and let all the angels of God worship him. And then continues, for he will avenge the blood of his sons and will render vengeance on his adversaries and will atone for his people and for his land and his people. So Justin writes in Deuteronomy 32:43, let all the angels of God worship him. So it kind of seems kind of straightforward. Justin shows us, oh, that phrase is missing from Deuteronomy 32:43. So it probably belonged in there, even though our Hebrew Old Testament didn't have that phrase. Justin probably had an old copy of it that included that, and so that means that we should probably have that phrase in the Hebrew. But then here's where things got just a little bit messy, and that is we find the Dead Sea Scrolls. We actually have Deuteronomy 32:43 in them, and we read this. Rejoice, O heavens, together with him, and bow down to him, all you gods. So it does not say angels, it instead says God. It says Elohim, which has led to a world of speculation. Was there a time period where the Jews actually believed in a plethora of gods, and the Lord was just one of those gods, and Deuteronomy 32 reflected that older view? This also has led to the writings of Michael Heiser. If any of you have heard of the writings that Michael Heiser writes, he's very popular in the angelic, demonic, world for people who really get into that. He writes about a group of sort of, I would call them higher up angelic beings that he calls the divine council, and refers to them as Elohim. 32:43 is one of the primary verses for this. And while I think Dr. Heiser and others build way too much out of this. I am someone who does believe that this is probably the original reading. That Deuteronomy 32:43 did say, and bow down to him, all you gods. And when it refers to gods, what it is simply referring to is angelic beings. There's already two other verses in the Bible where, very similar to calling angels gods, we have in the Old Testament, and that is in Genesis 6:2 and Job 1:6. Angels are referred to as sons of God or sons of Elohim. And I believe that Elohim, based on that verse and a few other verses, Elohim in the Hebrew world had two different meanings. One, it meant the God, the exalted God, but then also Elohim is a more generic word that just means spiritual beings. If someone is a non-physical, not a corporal being with their body, if they're a spiritual being, they fall under the category of Elohims. Like we are Adamah, God, angels together, they would all be the Elohim in the way that they used that word. And one of the ways that this sort of makes sense if you begin to think about it a little bit is that while in English we easily say there's God and then there's angels and then there's fallen angels who are demons. So we have these separate words for God, angels, demons. English, really easy. In the Hebrew world, they had no word for angel. The word for angelic being did not exist for the spiritual beings created by God. Now you'd be like, but Sean, I see the word angel in my Old Testament. Well, we translate it as angel, but the word that we translate into angel from the Old Testament is the Hebrew word malach. And the Hebrew word malach is simply the Hebrew word for messenger. So every time you see angel in the Old Testament, it's really just the Hebrew word for messenger. And that's why we look at those passages in the Old Testament where it talks about the angel of the Lord. And who do we say the angel of the Lord is in the Old Testament? That's Jesus Christ appearing before his incarnation. And then we're saying, well, the angel of the Lord is Jesus Christ before his incarnation, but he's not an angel, so why do we call him an angel? Well, it's because the Old Testament didn't call him an angel. The Old Testament called him the messenger of the Lord. And if John in John 1:1 calls Jesus the Word was with God and the Word was God in the beginning, what a more appropriate initial designation for the Word of God than the messenger of the Lord. Two very parallel terms together. So in the Hebrew world, they did not have a word for angel. So when they would speak of spiritual beings, at time they would refer to them as gods. And so I believe that what Deuteronomy 32:43 is simply saying is let all the spiritual beings, let all the angels and demons, angels, fallen angels, let all of them bow down and worship the Lord. This is not saying there's a whole bunch of gods out there, but it's just simply spiritual beings. But I think you could even work this in the way where Paul, when he talks about the pagan gods in the New Testament, what does he say about the idols? They're not really idols. They're demons. They're demons. The gods are demons. So I think that kind of Paul is working in that same kind of language when he talks about that way. So Deuteronomy 32:43 provides for us in the Dead Sea Scrolls the phrase, and bow down to him, all you gods, saying that all of the angelic beings, all spiritual beings, should bow down and worship the Lord. Probably the most controversial verse because it brings up the whole controversy about Heiser's divine counsel. If you know nothing about it, don't worry about it. It's kind of interesting stuff, but I think only partially true in certain ways. But that's an additional phrase that I think is probably correct from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And one of the ways we really pull down to that is that probably what Justin Martyr is referring to in his writing. And now we get to talk, shift gears totally different from angels and controversy to probably the least significant thing of all of this, and that is talking about the height of Goliath. How tall was Goliath? Well, in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 4, we read, and a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Now, that probably means nothing for you to hear that Goliath was 6 cubits and a span, since none of us measure in cubits today. But the Holman Christian Standard Bible translates those terms out for us. And 6 cubits and a span is a gigantean. That's not even a real word. A gigantus, that's probably not a word either. 9 feet, 9 inches tall. So Goliath was huge, 9 feet, 9 inches tall. But one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, titled 4Q Sam A, refers to Goliath as being 4 cubits and a span. So they take away 2 of Goliath's cubits, which brings him from being 9 feet 9 inches to 6 feet 9 inches. Poor Goliath. So Goliath wasn't quite the giant that we thought he was based on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, a lot of what I've read on this passage is from Tim Chaffee of Answers in Genesis. Tim is fantastic researching on this subject. One of the things that makes Tim so unique about writing on this subject is that Tim himself is 6 feet 8 inches tall. So he's just about the height of the Dead Sea Scrolls Goliath in and of himself as well. I actually think we probably look a little closer in height in that picture than we are in real life. So whoever was taking that, Jen, if you took that, thanks for making me probably look a little bit closer to Tim than I do, because he is a huge man. And if you ever go to the Answers in Genesis and you look at their scale models, there's multiple places where they have some giants in them, and Tim was the one who modeled for their giants in those dioramas. So, but Tim has a couple of notes on these. One thing that he writes about this is that Tim has lived his life as a man who is 6 feet 8 inches tall. And Tim's like, I'm big, but I've never caused multiple men to cower in fear over the size that I am. So when you read about how Goliath was making the Israelites cower in fear, it's kind of silly and ridiculous if he is only 6 feet 9 inches tall. That's intimidating, but not nearly what we read about in the book of 1 Samuel. The other reason why the height of 9 feet 9 inches is most likely correct is that if you look at the armor that Goliath was wearing in this passage, we read that his coat of mail, so his chainmail armor, weighed 125 pounds. And then we read that his spear, the tip of it alone, was 15 pounds. And then there would have been more, the actual spear itself on top of that tip. And then his chainmail and his spear were just the beginning of his armor. He would have had leg pieces on. He would have had arms on. He would have had a helm on. He would have had a sword that we know David pulled out and used to cut Goliath's head off. So this was just 2 pieces of his armor together weighing 140 pounds. And these weights are just simply unreasonable for a normal-sized man, even if he is 6 feet 9 inches tall, to bring into battle. If you remember, before David went to fight with Goliath, what did King Saul do? King Saul's like, David, put my armor on. And David's like, I'm not prepared for this. Like, I can't go out and use that. Well, if Goliath was going out and using the armor that was recorded in here, Goliath would have been like David. It would have been way too big for him to use when he was out there for a man his size. But if you understand that he's 9 feet 9 inches and is not the gaunt, 7.5 feet tall men that we see today, but one of sizable and ready for battle, 9 feet tall, then all of a sudden these measurements are appropriate for someone who is that large. So this is one of those places where I'd say, well, it's interesting that the Dead Sea Scrolls says 6 cubits. Maybe we had a copier who was writing in that manuscript and saw 6 cubits, and they were like, that can't be right, and changed it to 4. And you could clearly see that might have happened at one point. But I think most likely the genuine reading is the 6 feet tall, and to have him be a genuine giant at 9 feet 9 inches. All right, our next 2, which is our last 2, these are as far as I can tell, the longest additions that the Dead Sea Scroll brought to the Hebrew Bible. I have no idea if either of them are correct. I really don't feel strongly either way for both of them, but these are the longest 2 additions. And you'll see from both of them, neither of them are overly significant in changing our faith. The first comes from Exodus chapter 15, verses 20 and 21. In the New King James Version, they read, Then Miriam the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took the timbrel in hand, and all the women went out after her with timbrels and dances. And Miriam answered them, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea." So it has Miriam's song there being so very short. Simply those two lines: "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and its rider he has thrown into the sea." So that's it. That's all of Miriam's song. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls add more to Miriam's song. So there's additional lyrics following those lines. And the lyrics read as follow: "You despised your enemies. I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The Lord is my strength and my might. You are great, delivering your people. The enemy's hope has perished, and his memory is forgotten. Your enemies perished in the mighty waters. Your people will exalt you to the heights, for you have a covenant to our fathers, the one doing glorious things." So I have no issue with anything that's in these additional lyrics. I don't think there's a problem with any of them. I think they're all reflected of things that we see in other places in the Old Testament. Maybe Miriam did sing these songs, or this could have been somebody who read Miriam's short song and just thought, "I wish I knew the rest of it, and I wish it was longer. It probably was longer, and I wish I knew what it was. Maybe I could write more to it." And that's why a lot of this just, similar stuff that you see in other places in the Old Testament. So I don't think there's anything issue with it being longer or being shorter. One thing I should also point out is that if you were to pull this up in a book that had it recorded from the Dead Sea Scrolls, you would see multiple ellipses at places in the midst of it, and those ellipses would stand for other lines and gaps in the song. So actually in the manuscript that we have, it's longer even than what I just read, but we can't read certain sections of it, and so those are missing. The one thing that does make me doubtful of it is that one, it's not present anywhere outside of this Dead Sea Scroll manuscript. One thing that I like to see for ones that I'd say is probably more likely correct is it's reflected somewhere else outside of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So for instance, the Deuteronomy 32:43, Justin Martyr writes it in his writing. Or we might have a verse in the Samaritan Pentateuch, and it'd be located there in the Septuagint. This is located nowhere else. This was an entirely new discovery at the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I would like to think that, if this was genuine, we would have kept it in there. It would have been preserved, and somebody just probably thought it up. But maybe this was in there in the original recording of Exodus 15, and for some reason it was maybe at the end of a page, and the bottom of the page just got ripped out. I don't know. But there is a longer version of Miriam's song, which could be genuine, could be fan fiction, but I'd hold off with like an asterisk. I probably wouldn't preach off of it, but so that is our longest of the passages from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now here's our second longest, and this is sandwiched between the end of 1 Samuel 10 and the beginning of 1 Samuel chapter 11. So 1 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 and 2 read, "Then Nahash the Ammonite came up and encamped against Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, 'Make a covenant with us, and we will serve you.' And Nahash the Ammonite answered them, 'On this condition I will make a covenant with you, that I may put out all your right eyes and bring reproach on all Israel.'" So see what's happening here. The Ammonites attack Jabesh Gilead. Now, Jabesh Gilead is one of the cities that the Israelites had that were on the east bank of the Jordan River. So that means that it was separated from the rest of the land of Israel by the Jordan River itself. On top of that, it was basically like pushing right up against the land of Ammon. So it's natural that the Ammonites would want to attack Jabesh Gilead. So we see here that the Ammonites, led by Nahash, their king, they besieged the city of Jabesh Gilead. The men of that city, in order to avoid a very painful and difficult siege, no one wants to go through that, and hopefully to save their own life, they come and offer to make a covenant with Ammon. They come and say, "We will be your servants. It's like, you're going to get to win this, Nahash. You don't even have to fight for it, and we'll be your servants at the end of it. Win-win for you. And then Nahash's request just seems kind of crazy. Like he comes back and he's like, yeah, I'll make peace with you. I want you to take out all your right eyes. It's like, where in the world did that come from? Like, why do you want to take all their right eyes? Like this is nuts. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls have an entire paragraph that comes between 1 Samuel chapter 10 and 1 Samuel chapter 11 and gives the background to Nahash asking for all their right eyes. So the paragraph begins as follows. Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, pressed the Gadites and the Reubenites viciously. So let's pause right there and let's again just emphasize the point that the tribes that were located on the east of the Jordan River were the tribes of Gad and Reuben. So these were the people that were living right up against the Ammonites on that side of the Jordan River. They had been at war with Nahash, and he had basically been having his way with them. And then the passage continues. He put out the right eye of all of them and brought fear and trembling on Israel. Not one of the Israelites in the region beyond the Jordan remained, whose right eye Nahash, king of the Ammonites, did not put out, except 7,000 men who escaped from the Ammonites and went to Jabesh Gilead. So what this does in the Dead Sea Scrolls is it provides the background information for this, that it had been Nahash's policy, and he had been making war on Israel, that every time he would defeat one of their towns or areas in battle, he would put out their right eye, probably for a combination of, you're going to be a pretty bad soldier after you use your right eye and not be able to defend yourself very well. And also how humiliating it is to the Israelites that all of their tribes on the opposite side of the Jordan River, they're one by one, town by town, all the men in them are losing their right eye. And then on top of that, and this is the key to this, that in the midst of all of these little skirmishes, so we have to picture what warfare was like during this time period very often. It wasn't, all of the tribe of Reuben and all the tribe of Gad coming in big battles to fight the Ammonites, but it is probably more likely a certain number of Ammonite soldiers are going from town to town, picking off all these little towns and defeating them. Well, all of the men who had survived these battles, fled from them, were all going to what appeared to be the most defensible city on that side of the Jordan River, which was Jabesh Gilead. So at that point, the city of Jabesh Gilead had swelled in numbers and had all of these escaped soldiers there, 7,000 of them in total, and Nahash wanted to basically, finish off what he had started. He didn't want this one city with 7,000 soldiers in it left at peace. So if they're going to be servants of him, he wants all those guys that escaped from battle and didn't get their right eye taken out. He wanted their right eyes taken out now. So this is what we learn about from the Dead Sea Scrolls. My opinion about this passage. I don't believe it is inspired. I don't believe that it was an original account in the manuscript. But maybe this is just wishful thinking. And maybe it is. I like to think that this is genuine. And what I mean by genuine is somebody who was copying this manuscript, while they were making notes of this, they knew about additional background information for the passage. And so in the manuscript that they were writing about, they added that additional background information to 1 Samuel chapter 11 to explain more information about that passage and make sense of that requirement in 1 Samuel chapter 11, verse 2. And I got to say, if I'm honest, out of all of the changes to the Dead Sea Scrolls, I began and ended with my favorites. So my favorite addition is the addition of the word light in Isaiah chapter 53, verse 11, because I do think that is a prophecy that the Messiah will suffer. And then he will see the light of the Father. And I think it's pointing toward the Son's resurrection. And so I think that addition of light is really important. So I love that it's there in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it wasn't simply added by the church in the Septuagint of the Old Testament. So I think that's important. And I love that passage. And I'm so glad that that's there. But I also love this one, because this is precisely the kind of information that I wish was present all over the place in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The information that I wish was present in the Dead Sea Scrolls would be explaining a bunch of things that we no longer know about in history because it's been forgotten in course of time, and they knew about it because they're 2,000 years closer to the event than we were, and they recorded background information that has been lost over the course of time. So I share this to say this is what I really wish was present all over the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it kind of hurts my heart a little bit that this stuff is not present more often in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That we don't have more of those passages like where, if you remember with Moses, when he was on his way to the land of Egypt, and the angel of the Lord went to kill Moses right before he got to Egypt, and then his wife went and circumcised his son and threw the foreskin onto Moses and said, "You're a bridegroom of blood." Like, I wish that someone who was copying that knew the significance of that and could just in the margin write, "This is why she said that phrase. Like, this is what it really means." Because we don't really know what it means. That's been lost to us. But I like to think that this is somebody who knew what really happened, knew the background of it, and even though it's not inspired, shared this information with us so that we can know and better understand this passage that is there. Now, could someone have just been making it up? Sure. Like, could have been fan fiction stuff. But I like to think that this was maybe giving us a little bit more background information to the text and supply it there. But I share all this to say what I just showed you is, as far as I could see in my books that I had read, the information I looked up online, these were the most significant changes or corrections or additions to the Hebrew Bible in all the Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts that we found. Like, these were the most significant ones. Like, these were the biggest ones. And if you could see looking at them, for the most part, they're not overly significant. None of these are going to change our faith. Let us see that we've been seeing something wrong all the time. And I think it's important then to show where those differences are, where the most significant ones are, because I think that does help us know that we can have great integrity and trust in our Hebrew Bible. But I do think there are just a few little places where we need to just make small corrections from the New King James Version, and maybe they would come up with an update of it at some point to reflect some of these. I think they're putting them in the footnotes of most of the Bibles that are out today so that we can have Psalm 115, verse 14 when we read it in our churches, or have light when we go through Isaiah 53, verse 11. I think those are some important corrections, but I think they do illustrate that there are no earth-shattering discoveries in the Dead Sea Scrolls.